The call for more than 5,000 American troops to deploy to the U.S.-Mexico border has magnified our nation's immigration debate. And with the midterm elections just days away, some political pundits question how President Trump's order will affect people heading to the polls. Exactly how voters view immigration happens to be an area of interest for two Cornell professors. In an innovative study, they're examining how race, gender, and immigration attitudes will influence politics, in particular, the midterm elections. We recently traveled to Ithaca to meet with Cornell professors Peter Enns and Jonathan Schuldt to learn more about this unique study. Take a look. The study you've developed examines how the public's views on race, immigration, and gender will ultimately impact the midterm election. So I'm curious as to first how this idea came about and also why the focus on these particular issues as opposed to, say, Social Security and others, for example.
We were thinking in advance of the midterms coming up, really wanted to understand, it's a big election, obviously. And thinking back to 2016, these were issues that were very salient and had been brought to the surface more so even than previous elections. And so we wanted to know how immigration attitudes, sexism, racial bias, were these going to have an effect in the midterm? And if we look at what's recently happened, right, there's Trump's drawing attention to this migrant caravan, entering Mexico, Kavanaugh hearing, and sexual assault and concerns of sexism. These issues have been bubbling up, and the design of this survey is going to let us evaluate whether these issues end up affecting vote choice or not.
At its core, what are you hoping to find with this study, and what exactly do you want the public to learn from it?
Well, what we're ultimately trying to do is understand the social biases that might play a role in people's vote choice. And it's worth pointing out that oftentimes surveys are what we call cross-sectional surveys, right? They're conducted at one period of time, right? One of the great things about this project, what we're able to do, is to survey the same group of people at 3 different points in time. And that allows us to see if not only social biases might play a role in vote choice and sort of the candidates that people support, but if we see any patterns of shifting social biases over time that could play a role. And it's really that repeated interviewing structure that allows us to gain unique insight into shifting attitudes over time.
What types of questions are you asking participants, and what types of information will their answers reveal?
As you might imagine, you can't really ask, are you biased, right? And so you have to think about how are we going to word this. And so an example with trying to measure attitudes towards immigration and any potential biases, we ask, would you support or oppose building a border wall? And so then we ask other questions along those same lines. Do you think that immigrants to this country take away jobs or not? And so if we ask multiple questions along the same issue, then we can see how individuals respond and then get a better sense of who's more likely to be pro-immigration, who's more likely to be anti-immigration. And then we can connect that to whether they say they're going to vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate at repeated points in time, like John said.
And the other thing I would add is that back to the multi-interviews that we're doing is that it allows us to be sort of nimble and to tailor our questions to events as they arise. So for example, this summer, one thing that was on the public's mind was the administration's policy of separating children from their migrant families at the border. And so, for example, we put a question on the survey in Wave 1 that asked the public for the first word that comes to their mind when they think about that activity that was happening at the time. And so that allowed us to ask a sort of unique question that a lot of other polls don't include. And getting these sort of spontaneous top-of-mind associations really allowed unique insight. And what we saw is that overwhelmingly, the responses that we captured were negative. People were saying things like sad, people were saying things like horrible, right? And using that kind of open-ended question just gives us a little bit of a different angle than a standard question of how much do you oppose or support this policy.
I've read that the questions in the first and last survey are incredibly important. Explain why.
Sure. So that's where these immigration questions, attitudes toward race, attitudes toward gender are in the first and the third wave. And to get back to your earlier point about why is understanding any relationship between bias and vote choice important, it really, we need to understand this for a couple of reasons. If we underestimate how bias plays in, we're not understanding how racial bias, anti-immigration bias is influencing political decisions. But the flip side also occurs if we overestimate. So let's say people are, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and it's based on job considerations or it's based on healthcare attitudes. And we're hearing stories of, well, Trump just tweeted about a migrant caravan, that's why people are voting for Republicans or voting against Republicans. If we overestimate how much bias plays into people's voting decisions, it makes politics even more polarized, because it's no longer, oh, my neighbor's a Republican because he or she has always been a Republican and cares about certain Republican issues. It's, oh, that person must think this about immigrants, right? So we really need to get it right and understand when bias plays a role in politics and when it doesn't, or when it doesn't quite as much as we thought.
The first of the 3 surveys found that 89% of those who strongly support Black Lives Matter indicate they would vote for the Democratic candidate. Among those who strongly oppose the movement, only 8 indicate they would vote for a Democrat. So some may not find these results to be surprising. When you dig beyond the layers, though, what sorts of attitudes and voter trends can you speculate with responses such as this one that may not necessarily be apparent on the surface level?
One of the things that we're seeing is on some questions we see sort of classic polarization. And the question you just saw, right? We saw, Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. Perhaps not that surprising. But what our data are suggesting so far is that the story is not always that simple. So on other questions, we actually see a surprising amount of overlap and commonality. So for example, I already mentioned the open-ended responses to the policy of separating children from their families, right? That seemed like there was a negative response on both sides. We also, in our last wave, asked a question about support for news media. Given all the rhetoric we've seen around fake news and some in the administration casting doubt even on news coverage of hurricanes, right? With Hurricane Maria, there was some questioning by the president of whether or not 3,000 people really died during Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And what we found, perhaps surprisingly, is that people on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, supporters of the president and people who disapprove of the president, overwhelmingly endorsed the importance of media when it comes to coverage of natural disasters and humanitarian crises. So really, you gotta dig a little deep, and it might depend on the issue where we see polarization occurring and where we don't.
Are you noticing that attitudes are slightly shifting?
The third wave will get the data back on November 2nd, so right before the election. And so we think that's going to give us a great window into what is likely to happen, because we're going to be able to see whether vote intentions have shifted since our first wave in July, and we're going to be able to see whether attitudes on any of these issues have shifted and whether they're shifting together. So we don't know if they are, and the data will tell us.
What types of things contribute to attitude shifts? So beyond political robocalls and campaign ads, what else can impact voters and really change their perspectives and their attitudes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the data will tell, but certainly what the literature suggests is it's not just the efforts of, say, campaigns and the candidates themselves doing negative ads. We, of course, see that a lot every time an election comes around. But, of course, there are political events that happen, right? For example, the migrant caravan that Peter mentioned, right? I mean, now this is an issue that's probably going to be interpreted through the lens of an immigration issue, right? And because we have data from wave 1 that speak to the public's attitudes towards immigration, and we can follow up with them in a couple of weeks to see how those attitudes of the very same people might have changed, right, from July until late October. If we see a difference there, right, it's possible that something like news coverage of the migrant caravan might be responsible for that. It's always hard to say with precision, but that's the sort of power of the sort of time 1, time 2 comparisons that our survey allows us to do.
When the midterm elections come to an end on November 6th, your work continues, and you will be analyzing the implications of this survey for quite some time. So explain why, what will you be looking for, and how will you be using this information moving forward?
Sure. So we'll be looking for whether the strength of attitudes and responses on these issues between the first wave and vote intentions in that first wave and the third wave. Did they get stronger or not? Did they get weaker? We're going to look to your previous question. Did attitudes change at all? We have this measure of essentially implicit sexism, and so we've got that before the hearings for Brett Kavanaugh and after, and that was a very salient issue related to sexual assault and gender issues. And so we're really going to be interested in comparing at the different points in time. And then we're also going to be interested in how is media covering the election. And we think if media, there's going to be a lot of different data sources and some stories relying on certain data or no data. And we hope that if stories getting a lot of attention aren't consistent with our results, that we can be part of the conversation and bring our data to the conversation and say, well, we've ran the study throughout the midterms, and here's what our data suggests, and we think this needs to be kept in mind.
The 2018 midterm elections will take place on Tuesday, November 6th. Now, polls open at 6 a.m. and close at 9 p.m. Be sure to stay tuned to WXXI Radio and television for Election Day results and analysis.